All right, let's move on with what the valves look like in the heart. There are there are four valves. There are the atrioventricular valves, which makes sense. Atrio for the top atrium, ventricular. There's the right, which is called the tricuspid, and then the left, which is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve. You might have heard this as a mitral valve most often. The atrioventricular valve, the tricuspid, has three flaps, hence tri. It's all connective tissue, and they are attached to the inside of the myocardium via the chordae tendineae that we talked about a little bit ago. The left atrioventricular valve, the bicuspid, has two cusps, and the endpoints are also attached to the chordae tendineae in the right ventricle. Now, the semilunar valves are a little bit different. These are going to be separating the ventricles and arteries leaving the heart. So you have the pulmonary semilunar valves. So this is from the right ventricle, and then the aortic semilunar valves, and this will be from the left ventricle. And so what these look like are these half-moon cusps, which is, why they call it a cusp, because it looks like a half moon, and they are also attached to the arterial walls. Here you're looking at just a simple section through a relaxed atrium where you'll find a tricuspid valve. Now the circuits that move blood through the body rely on these valves to keep blood flowing in a uniform direction. So here on the right atrium here, this would be the separation between the right and the left atrium to the ventricle. So this would be the atrioventricular valve here. When the right ventricle contracts, blood is ejected out into the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary circulation, where CO2 is basically dropped off and we breathe it out from our lungs, and oxygen is picked up. The oxygenated blood then flows in through the left atrium and down to the left ventricle, going through the left atrioventricular valve, and then blood's going to flow out of the left ventricle up through the aorta to either superior or inferior circulation. And so oxygenated blood almost always goes through arteries, with the exception of the blood's coming back into the left atrium. This is a vein. So remember, what is an artery and what is a vein? Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Here, from the right ventricle, we have an artery carrying deoxygenated blood to pulmonary circulation. This is deoxygenated, but it's still considered an artery because arteries are defined by direction of blood flow. Here, into the left atrium, we have blood returning from pulmonary circulation. Those are veins. And so remember, arteries and veins identify direction of blood flow. So this is a vein draining into the heart, but in this particular case, it's draining into the left atrium. Let me get our eraser here so you can see the heart a little bit better. There we go. So the difference between our two different types of circulation is we have systemic circulation and pulmonary. Pulmonary gets rid of CO2, charges our red blood cells up with oxygen, sends it out to systemic circulation, which is circulation out from the heart to the body and back. So out to the body is going to be oxygenated, and returning is going to be deoxygenated. So the pathway of our blood starts from our body or the heart into the right atrium, from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve out to the pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary arteries, where the blood eliminates, CO2 leaves. You'll talk about this more in physiology. Oxygen attaches to hemoglobin. And then from the pulmonary veins, the blood flows into the left atrium, from the left atrium down to the bicuspid, through the bicuspid valve, out the left ventricle to body circulation. And the blood just keeps going around and around and around this way, following steps 1 through 6, as long as you're alive. Now, the cardiac cycle itself consists of the contraction of the heart and the relaxation of the heart. And it turns out that the atria and the ventricles contract separately. The atria contract simultaneously, roughly simultaneously. The right starts, the left follows very soon after, while the ventricles are relaxed. And then as the atria relax, the ventricles contract. So basically, you have a top to bottom contraction. You'll talk a lot about how this happens in physiology. I'm not going to go over the details, but when we measure blood pressure, what we're measuring is the systole, or the contraction, usually of the ventricles, and the diastole, or the relaxation of the ventricles. The reason why blood pressure is measured this way is because we are actually measuring how hard the left ventricle is pushing blood out to the body. There is a systole and a diastole for the atria as well. We just don't measure them or use it as a measure of general health. So this is the cardiac cycle. It starts with the atrial systole, where the atria are going to contract, sending blood down into the ventricles. Ventricles are relaxed at this point. As the atrial systole ends, the diastole begins, which means the atria relax. And at this point, the atrioventricular valves close. They snap close. At this point, the ventricular systole begins. In other words, the ventricles begin to contract, and the semilunar valves going out to the blood vessels open up to allow blood flow out to either pulmonary circulation or systemic circulation. Ventricular systole then is the second phase, all right, contraction, spraying blood out into circulation. And then you have ventricular diastole. At this point, when ventricular diastole happens, very, very briefly, the entire heart is relaxed. But then you'll have, at the late phase of ventricular diastole, the atria are filled with blood, and the blood starts to leave from the atria down into the ventricles again. And so that brings us back to atrial systole. Yes, that is a lot of physiology, and you will cover that in a whole lot more detail in physiology. We just thought we'd give you a little heads up. So how is all of this being coordinated in the heart? Well, the heart itself has its own little internal nervous system. We call it the cardiac conduction system. And so the cardiac conduction system starts up here in the upper right, let me get my pointer working again, in the upper right portion of the right atrium at the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is a group of basically sensitive cells that initiate the contraction in the right atrium. There is a branch that branches out over, you can't see it over here, to the left atrium. And so when the sinoatrial node signals cardiac contraction to start in the atria, it starts up here at the SA node, and then these internodal pathways send the signal to the myocardium over on the left atrium, and then farther down through the right atrium. This starts the cardiac cycle. As the two atria contract, the signal travels down to the atrioventricular node here, where then the contraction signal goes down through the bundle of His. They'll call them right or left bundles, and then spreads out through the Purkinje fibers. The signal is then kind of decoded. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's decoded by the myocardium, where the myocardium then starts contracting. So as that happens, the atria are quiet. So the atria contract, signal travels down, atria relax, ventricles contract. So the components are the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the atrioventricular bundle or bundle of His, which is the old nomenclature, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers through which the action potentials travel. And so we can also follow the contraction through the SA node, down from the SA node, spreading across, like I said, it spreads from the right to the left atria. As the contraction or the signal, it's basically a bunch of action potentials traveling through individual cells of the cardiac muscle. As that signal gets to the atrioventricular node, remember atrioventricular, separating the two, right? The action potentials travel down through the bundles of His. and branch out to the myocardium deep in the ventricles, allowing the myocardium to get the signal, hey, contract, and that starts the ventricular contraction while the atria are relaxing. Bradycardia is a condition where the heart is contracting too slowly, and that can have something to do with maybe the conduction system of the heart. Tachycardia is when the heart contracts too fast. And again, that can be some issues having to do with the electrical system in the heart. You'll talk about that in physiology. So how do you measure this? Using an EKG. This again is a little bit more physiology, but it's always good to know how the heart works and how to measure how the heart is working. Basically, an EKG or an ECG, an electrocardiogram, measures the electric currents as they are spreading through the heart. And so basically what you're doing is you're mounting electrodes in different parts of the body and comparing the spread of those currents through the body. We also have other areas where there's no current spread. Those are the grounds. And so we have the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. The P wave happens when you have the signal or the action potential spreading across the atria. The QRS complex is where you have the signal or the action potential spreading from the AV node down through the bundle of His and out through the bundle fibers. And then the T wave is where the ventricles are relaxing. And so this is just a real simple overview of contraction and the QRS-X complex in the heart. So how is all this regulated? The SA node actually gets information from, remember the medulla, here it is, the cardioacceleratory center, which increases the heart rate for whatever reason when you have sympathetic activation. Remember, fight or flight? We have a cardioinhibitory center that is run under parasympathetic activation, rest and digest. So we have centers in the medulla that tell the SA node speed up or slow down based on what's happening at the time. Remember, sympathetic, you feel bad because the guy is running away from the hungry bear. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. Both systems innervate the SA node and allow the SA node to regulate the AV node and thereby control the atrial and ventricular pace of myocardial contraction. All right, folks, hope that wraps it up for you there. I will post some videos for you guys to look at the direction of heart flow, or blood flow through the heart and action potential spread through the heart as well.